The RCMP Heritage Centre is a not-for-profit charitable organisation mandated to share the story of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This is one of those stories, part of your heritage.
Quite an experience, and really gave me, even piqued my interest more in the history and the ties with the royal family that the RCMP has had over the years. N Division has got such a marvelous history for the force, and I'm not sure that there's many people work here, I think, in the college and in the stables, and don't realize what a marvelous history was here in N Division. When the force, when we became the modern force in 1920, they shipped some, I don't want to get the numbers wrong, but around 180 horses and 200 and some men from Regina, which had been our headquarters. And when they got here to Ottawa, of course, obviously they knew beforehand, I'm sure, but there was no real place to keep the horses, so they kept the horses and men at Lansdowne Park. They got here in March, St. Paddy's Day, I believe, 1920. And so the horses and men stayed there, and they started in the summer, because the exhibition was on even then. They had to find a place for the men and horses to go while the exhibition was on. So the summer of 20, they went to over near where the old headquarters, Sandy Hill, was. And then they started coming here in 1921, and they'd stay in bell tents. The men would stay in tents, and the horses would be tethered outside, and they'd stay till first frost in October here, because this had been the Dominion of Canada rifle range, and then it was handed over during the First World War to the armed forces. But some of the interesting things, the very first musical ride ever performed in Eastern Canada was in 1920, and they actually, I think it was the 28th of June, they did one at Lansdowne Park, and then on the 28th or the 29th, they mounted up early in the morning. It was something like 5 o'clock in the morning. And how times have changed. They rode all the way to North Gore. They had a wagon follow them with all their kit and the tents and everything, and they actually, they stayed in tents overnight, got up the next morning, rode to Prescott, and camped there overnight, and then rode to Brockville for the 1st of July, 1920, when they performed for, I think it was the Dominion of Canada, the Dominion Travelers group, and then retrace the whole thing. And the reason I bring that up is today, these many years later, the musical ride travels in North America with custom-built trailers, a custom, or not a custom bus, but a top-of-the-line bus with TVs and access to computers, and they stay in the best hotels, or very good hotels, I shouldn't say the best, and have per diems, which I'm sure the people of 1920 had heard nothing about. So it was. I always thought that was pretty interesting. The history here. Air Division, the first Air Division was here. The Dogs for the North used to be trained here. The first lab was here. There was an awful lot of history here, and of course, the musical ride is the embodiment of the history of the force, going back to, I mean, there are those who say that they might have done one as early as 1876. I personally think that's a little unlikely, since the very first one ever done in Great Britain was 1882. So I think what they probably would have done would have been some form of course, the musical ride is just troop drill done to music. So they could have done some form of that to keep the men occupied. But as we know, the very first one took place in Regina in 1887. And in fact, there were 5 done that year. often people say, well, it wasn't a public display because it was for Lord Dewdney, but that I don't believe is necessarily true, because if you read, it was, one of them was for Lord Dewdney, the Lieutenant Governor, and his entourage. But if you read the history of it, the other ones were for people in town or friends and such. So I tend to believe that, and as we do here at this branch, that was the beginnings, 1887. And the musical ride was hit and miss for a number of years after that, in large part due to circumstances such as the rebellion, the Northwest Rebellion, lack of funds. Some things never changed, that came and went. In the early 1900s, there were a number of them. They started doing, I think, around 1904 in Brandon. I often have been asked, and was asked when I was in the force, is the musical ride relevant anymore? And to that I say absolutely, and I speak from 37 years, 37 out of my 41 years in the RCMP were spent here with the musical ride. I was with the musical ride for parts of 5 decades, so I've traveled the length and breadth of our country, the United States, throughout Europe and such, and I've seen with my own eyes that while society, of course, has changed, as the roles of the RCMP have changed, but the musical ride is every bit as popular today everywhere I've traveled as it was when I first started in the 1970s. We still go to small town Canada. It's not uncommon to go to a town of 500 or 600 people, especially out west, and maybe have 3,000 or 4,000 show up for the show, raising money for charity. So I really believe it is relevant, and what people maybe that even within our force sometimes don't realize is the musical ride isn't just about the tradition. It's about, we use the musical ride as the vehicle to get the public to come forward and meet the men and women, the modern men and women who police this country. And to give them, that gives the men and women the opportunity to talk with the public, to talk with the children, talk with the adults and the seniors, and show them that, you know what, these people, these police officers are real people. And I think that is every bit as important today, and in some aspects maybe even more important. The men and women that we've got on the musical ride are today, I think, are in some ways different than what we were. Al, you being an old ride person, as myself, is you know, they are more educated, they're more communication savvy than what we were in our day, where it was just go out and ride and work hard, play hard, come to work tomorrow, smile if you could. I mean, I think you may remember at one time when even smiling for whatever reason was verboten while you were doing the musical ride. And now it truly is, to me, a wonderful public relations vehicle. And if it wasn't, people wouldn't keep coming to see it. So the naysayers, I always say, well, how come when we go to Europe, like we did in 2012, we increased the attendance at the Royal Windsor Horse Show by as much as 25%. We had standing room only in Germany at one of the venues. Exeter, England, again, where we have places that we have been before, and people still come back. We put on an annual show here at N Division called Sunset Ceremonies, that I was part of the original one in 1989, that we thought would last for a few years. It was a little something else to do. We could stay home with the ride at certain times of the year, and that maybe 3 or 4 years down the road it would run its course. It is still an annual event, and we still get capacity crowds, people, many of them who came here as teenagers and now are coming back with their own children to see the show. And while it's an hour-and-a-half show, it is still the jewel of the whole show is the musical ride, and that's what people come to see the horses and get the opportunity to talk to the men and women, these police officers who do this for 2 years and then go back to police work. So I most definitely, I mean, obviously, I guess I'm a poor one to ask that for, because I believe very strongly in the musical ride, and I think it definitely does. We have people come from all over the world to come here to visit, and they truly do. They see the musical ride as part of the history of Canada, and to use that term maybe too often used as iconic about our history. And we should be very proud of that. And it obviously, what the men and women on the ride do, you'd be surprised the impact it has on some people, and especially visitors. And I very quickly tell you here, a few minutes ago when I had to run back over to the stables before I did this to pick something up, I think this may tell you what an impact we have, or the ride has on people. As I was walking through the stable, there was a tour coming through, and there was a gentleman walked up to me and said, "You probably don't remember me, but I was bringing a tour through here on the day of the infamous day of 9/11. And he said, all the Mounties, pretty well all the Mounties were gone, but you were here. And I had a tour of people from, I myself can't quite remember when. And he said, you took the time to go and put your red serge on and come and stand for pictures and smile despite what was going on in the world. And he said, I just wanted to tell you that made these people's trip. And he said it's something that he would always remember. And I quite honestly didn't remember who it was, and that's not to pat myself on the back, it's to try and say that it really is important. It's things that make people think well of the mounted police and think well of this great country that we live in. The relationship with Her Majesty, the RCMP's relationship with Her Majesty, of course, goes back, even predates Her Majesty, of course. And when Her Majesty became the sovereign, she also became, the force made her honorary commissioner, as her father and uncle before her were, and one of those things that actually got changed, because she never should have been honorary. She should have been what in 2012 we rectified it and made her the commissioner-in-chief of the RCMP. But that's a bit of another story. So Her Majesty and members of the royal family have always been very fond of Canada. I think that goes without saying. She's visited Canada more than any other country. And she's been very fond of the RCMP, but of course the musical ride, most people know that she has a wonderful love of horses. And as early as in 1969, the RCMP and the Canadian government gave her a horse named Burmese, who subsequently became Her Majesty's favorite horse of all the horses that she's had. And Her Majesty rode Burmese for 18 trooping the colors, which is a record. And actually, by the way, when Burmese eventually did die, Her Majesty has her buried, one of the few horses that she actually had buried at Windsor Castle with her own headstone. So there was that tie. Then in 1973, the RCMP centennial, we gave her a second horse. So we also, in the musical ride, whenever Her Majesty comes to Canada, and especially to Ottawa, if weather permitting, we give her a carriage escort with the state landau and all the men and women that we can muster together. So we've always got those ties. As I said, I had the good fortune of being at Buckingham Palace learning some of the driving, and met her in '88. And then actually in 1998 then, there was a movement afoot, first started by, as I understand, the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia for some reason or other thought, well, you know, the RCMP should give Her Majesty another horse. My understanding, she kind of went, no, thanks, I've got enough, whatever. It went back and forth, and for whatever reason, eventually someone convinced her it no longer had anything to do with British Columbia, but that would she be interested in a horse for the RCMP 125th, I think is what it was, or the Canada's one, right? 1998 anyway. So at that point I had the opportunity to be part of choosing the horse, reschool the horse. He was a horse named James. Got to make that presentation in October of 1998 and met Her Majesty, obviously. I was very proud to be part of that. She subsequently changed the horse's name to St. James. She names most of her horses or changes them. Not all of them, but most of them. So James, by the way, then became Prince Charles's charger for the Trooping the Colour, which is probably the biggest parade in the world, military thing. It's incredible. A couple of thousand marching men, horses all over the place. And James performed exceptionally well. One of the interesting stories I'll tell you is that I was schooling George along with St. James, who was there, and one day I was Her Majesty's stud groom, Mr. Terry Pendry, was riding James just down at the castle where the show was going to take place, and I was riding George. And on the way back, he stepped on we stopped at a temporary gate, and George stepped on when I went to move him so they could open the gate, he stepped on a big, what was left of a branch, and slipped, fell, down he and I both went. I landed on my left elbow with him on top of me, crushed my elbow, put a few nicks on him, nothing big. I was a little more worried about that than anything else, and I'm going, oh my word. So I ended up in hospital in boots and breeches, if you imagine going into a London, outside of Windsor, a big hospital. Ended up, as I recall, I certainly had my boots off, but the next day they did I think it was a 5.5-hour operation to put the elbow back in a big cast, full length of my arm, and I'm going, oh great. Here I've trained all these years and want to present this horse to Her Majesty, and now I've got my left arm like my elbow was broken in six places. But anyway, I got to, they put a cast on, and got to chat with Her Majesty a few times about it. She actually called to find out if I was okay, and when I got back to the castle the next day, she wanted to see me, and we had a little chat about the elbow. But I was able to get my red serge on over, I think it was 10 days later. They told me I wouldn't be able to ride for 6 months, but I was determined to to do this. And no great bravery or anything, actually. It didn't even need pacing. Once the cast was set, couldn't do much more damage. So anyway, I got to in another big presentation to present George in 2009, and then again in 2012, when it was coming up Her Majesty's Diamond Jubilee. She let it be known quietly that she wouldn't mind, she didn't want any other live gifts, but if the Mounties would consider giving me another horse, which I thought was really pretty neat. I mean, that this is one that she would like. As it turns out, we had a young mare that I had actually had the farm manager name Elizabeth in honor of Her Majesty's mother, the late Queen Mother. Not with anything in mind other than I knew the great ties that the royal family had with us. And this mare turned out to be a really nice little mare, really nice and quiet, the type that I thought would get the job done for what they want it for. And anyway, the long and the short of it, the decision was made to give Her Majesty a horse to celebrate this wonderful watershed moment of Diamond Jubilee. So I completed the training of Elizabeth, and once again took her over 6 weeks early to get her acclimatized, because she was quite a young mare. This time I was careful not to put myself in I didn't want to break the other elbow. So we got the, a couple of days before the mare was to be presented, Her Majesty let it be known through the Crown Equerry and the stud groom that she'd like to come down to the stables and see the new mare. And so I kind of thought maybe something was up. Mr. Pendry, her stud groom, who is the man who looks after her own horses, said, you know, Bill, why don't you get into your red serge and you take Her Majesty around to look at all the horses, which she does on a regular basis. I thought, oh, I had my uniform there. That's fine. I'd do that. And so anyway, I took her around. We looked at all the horses and looked at the new mare and looked her all over. And when we were done that, we walked back to her car, and Her Majesty was in her kerchief, and I remember a green jacket. And we were standing at the car, and she goes, well, you know, Bill, it's really, really nice of the RCMP to continue this tradition of giving me a horse. She goes, you know what, it's 5 now since Burmese. And she goes, you know, you've been part of 3 of them. You've trained 3 and presented them to me. So she goes, I've got a little something for you. And she puts her hand in the pocket, pulls out, hands me this box. It's got the letters MVO written on it. And this medal, a member of the Royal Victorian Order, you know, to say that I was surprised, honored. Mr. Pendry said the only time he'd ever seen me stuck for something to say. It was really, I'm sure, one of the highlights of my life. And to have received it in the manner that I received it. Normally, people that get the member of the Royal Victorian Order receive it in an official at the castle or at the palace. But to get it from her privately in such a manner made it even more touching to me. Just briefly, a member of the Royal Victorian Order, it doesn't make me anything other than I've got this great medal, but it was started by Queen Victoria to honor her Diamond Jubilee, and what made me doubly honored, I guess, if you will, is that for Queen Elizabeth's Diamond Jubilee, I was the only Canadian to receive the MVO. One other person, I believe, later on got the next level of it, was bumped up to the next level of it. So that was a great, certainly a great honor, and put me right in there with the very first Canadian, by the way, to ever receive it was, again, our friends Sir Sam Steele got it, I think, in 1902. So that was just a wonderful way to kind of end up my career. And I had one other thing after this. This took place in May, and in June we, after 6 years of sort of doing in the planning stages, I'd been trying to get it so that the RCMP, the members of the musical ride, could take part in the mounting of Her Majesty's Lifeguard. And what it is basically is there's members of one of the 2 household cavalry regiments, the Blues and Royals, or the Lifeguards, ride from Knightsbridge Barracks to Horse Guards, which is at Buckingham Palace, and they actually mount the guard, and it's now more of a ceremony thing, but they actually are there to protect the sovereign. They were in the day, and now it has become more of it's a great tourist attraction, and they do it for 24 hours, and then the next day they're replaced. And there's great pomp and pageantry. They have the mounted band if the weather's fine, and if Her Majesty's in residence. And so after a few years of trying to get it done, it was eventually agreed that on the Diamond Jubilee year, we would be allowed to do it. And there's only been one other time that a non-British regiment has done it, and that is the Canadian Royal the Lord Strathcona's horse, to mark their 100th anniversary in 2000. And so when we got to do it again, and another wonderful moment in my life and career was carrying the guidon through downtown London. As you're well aware, the guidon is our most sacred item in any regiment, and to have the honor and privilege of carrying it, let alone in London. One of the other interesting quick tidbits was before we left Knightsbridge Barracks, the commanding officer came down and said, "We've just got a call from Buckingham Palace. Her Majesty wants to know, when are my Mounties coming by?" And sure enough, and we actually have a photograph of this as we were riding by Buckingham Palace along the side of it, where we give an eye's right anyway if Her Majesty's in residence. The curtain was pulled back and Her Majesty stepped out and had a look and stood and watched us ride, her Mounties ride by Buckingham Palace. And that just was the icing on the cake to what was a wonderful event. And to me, it was kind of another one of those wow things in a career that I was very fortunate to spend 37 out of 41 years doing what I loved to do, what I wanted to do. I've taken part in a number of really, really memorable, some very positive, memorable. Vimy Ridge, the 90th anniversary of Vimy Ridge, leading Her Majesty up. A very sad but memorable one was the Merithorpe Memorial in Edmonton, leading them in again with the guidon. But I've been, the biggest memories for me, and the thing I'm the proudest of, I believe, is not only being a Rough Rider, which I became as a trainer, becoming a sergeant major and the riding master were all things I was proud of. But the things I was most proud of was to have the opportunity for 37 years to travel the length and breadth of this great country and represent this wonderful force that we are a part of, and to see how the people really think about us, the people that do deal with our members day to day. And then on top of that, to be able to travel around the world and have the privilege, again, to not only represent a police force, but to represent your country. And I was always so proud to see how, whether I was in South America, in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Europe, anywhere in the world, to see how people feel about this great country of ours, and that we were representatives as Mounties, the iconic red serge, black horse. That certainly is something that will always remain with me, and something that I was truly privileged to do. And that's pretty well the end of 37 years here and a 41-year career.